At the lawyer's office, I found out my trust fund was signed over to my sister. So I quietly sold shares. A month later, my dad texted me, "The tuition money is gone." I just replied, "Oh really? Chill, not mine." The mahogany desk stretched between me and Mr. Patterson like an ocean of polished wood. His silver-rimmed glasses caught the afternoon light streaming through his law office windows as he shuffled through papers with the deliberate precision of someone who'd delivered bad news countless times before. I'd come here expecting routine paperwork, maybe some tax forms to sign. Instead, I was about to discover how thoroughly my family had betrayed me. "Miss Chen, I'm afraid there's been a significant change to your trust fund," Patterson began, his voice carrying that carefully measured tone lawyers use when they're about to ruin your day. "Your father executed new documentation 8 months ago." The leather chair creaked as I leaned forward. "What kind of change?" He slid a thick document across the desk. The legal jargon swam before my eyes, but certain phrases jumped out like neon signs in the darkness: transfer of beneficiary rights, Madison Claire Chen, and revocation of previous arrangements. My sister's name was scattered throughout the pages like confetti at a funeral. "Your trust fund, established by your maternal grandmother's estate, has been reassigned to your sister Madison," Patterson explained. "The full amount, approximately $1.2 million, is now under her control." The room tilted slightly. I gripped the armrests of my chair, my knuckles turning white against the burgundy leather. "How is that possible? Grandma Lou left that money specifically for my education and future." Patterson adjusted his glasses. "Your father, as the trustee, had discretionary power to make such changes until your 25th birthday. Since you're currently 24, the transfer was legally permissible. The documentation shows your sister's financial circumstances required immediate assistance." Financial circumstances? Right. Madison's cocaine habit and her boyfriend Derek's gambling debts weren't exactly what Grandma Lou had in mind when she'd worked 16-hour days at her restaurant to build that nest egg. But apparently, my father saw things differently. I drove home in a daze, my Honda Civic feeling smaller somehow, as if the walls were closing in around me. The familiar streets of Scottsdale blurred past my windows. Our house sat at the end of Desert Willow Drive, a sprawling ranch-style structure that screamed upper middle class with its manicured desert landscaping and 3-car garage. Dad's BMW gleamed in the driveway next to Mom's white Lexus SUV. The front door opened before I could reach for my keys. Madison stood there, designer handbag slung over her shoulder, looking like she was heading out for another shopping expedition. Her blonde hair cascaded over her shoulders in perfect waves, and her makeup was flawless despite it being 3 in the afternoon. She'd always been the prettier one, the charming one, the one who could talk her way out of any situation. "Hey, sis," she chirped, her voice artificially bright. "How was your meeting with Patterson?" The casual way she asked told me everything. She knew. Of course she knew. "Interesting," I replied, studying her face for any flicker of guilt. "There wasn't any." Cool. "I'm meeting Derek for dinner. Catch you later." She breezed past me toward her brand new Mercedes convertible, a car I now realized had been purchased with my inheritance money. The engine purred to life, and she reversed out of the driveway with the carefree attitude of someone who'd just won the lottery. Inside, the house felt different. The familiar cream-colored walls seemed to mock me, and the family photos lining the hallway told a story I was only now beginning to understand. There were dozens of pictures of Madison at prom, Madison graduating high school, Madison at various award ceremonies. My photos were there too, but relegated to smaller frames, tucked into corners like afterthoughts. Mom was in the kitchen, stirring something that smelled like her famous chicken enchilada casserole. Her graying hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and she wore the same floral apron she'd had for 10 years. She looked up when I entered, her smile faltering slightly when she saw my expression. "Sweetheart, how did your appointment go?" "You know how it went, Mom." She turned back to the stove, her shoulders tensing. "Your father made the decision he thought was best for the family." "Best for Madison, you mean?" "She needed help, Emma. You're doing fine on your own with your psychology degree." "Doing fine on my own." I was 24, working 2 part-time jobs to save money for graduate school, living at home to cut expenses, and driving a car with 180,000 miles on it. Madison was 26, unemployed, addicted to expensive drugs, and dating a man who'd already borrowed money from 3 different loan sharks. But sure, I was the one who was doing fine. Dad emerged from his home office, his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled up. Michael Chen had built his accounting firm from nothing, and his success showed in everything from his Italian leather shoes to his Rolex watch. He taught both Madison and me the value of hard work, but somewhere along the way, those lessons had gotten lost in translation. "Emma, I know you're upset about the trust fund situation," he began, using his boardroom voice. "But Madison is in a very precarious position right now. Derek owes some dangerous people a significant amount of money, and your sister's future depends on getting this resolved quickly." "So you stole my inheritance to pay off her boyfriend's gambling debts?" His jaw tightened. "I didn't steal anything. I made an executive decision as the trustee. The money is staying in the family. It's staying with a family member who's dating a criminal. Derek made some mistakes, but he's trying to turn his life around." I laughed, a bitter sound that echoed off the kitchen tiles. "Dad, he's been turning his life around for 3 years. How much money have you already given them?" The silence that followed answered my question. This wasn't the first time they'd bailed out Madison and Derek. The trust fund transfer was just the latest installment in an ongoing financial rescue mission. Later that evening, I sat in my childhood bedroom, staring at acceptance letters from 3 different universities. UC Berkeley, Northwestern, and Boston University had all offered me spots in their graduate programs for psychology. I had already completed my bachelor's degree in psychology at Arizona State, graduating summa cum laude with a 3.9 GPA. The deadlines for accepting these offers were approaching, and I'd been counting on the trust fund money to make my choice freely, without drowning in student debt. My laptop screen glowed in the darkness as I researched student loan options. The numbers were sobering. Even with the research assistantships I'd been offered, I'd be looking at significant debt for a doctoral degree. Meanwhile, Madison was probably outspending my inheritance on bottle service at some overpriced nightclub. But as I scrolled through loan calculators and scholarship databases, a different idea began to take shape. I pulled up my investment portfolio, something I'd been quietly building since my sophomore year of college. While Madison had been partying and failing her way through community college, I'd been learning about the stock market. Every dollar from my part-time jobs that didn't go toward textbooks or gas had gone into carefully researched investments. My portfolio was modest compared to the trust fund, but it represented years of disciplined saving and smart choices. Technology stocks, blue-chip dividends, and a few aggressive growth plays had grown my initial investment of $5,000 into nearly $28,000. More importantly, it was entirely under my control. I opened my trading account and began analyzing my holdings. The tech sector had been performing exceptionally well, and several of my positions had gained significant value over the past year. If I liquidated everything strategically, I could raise enough cash to make a substantial down payment on my future, even without the trust fund. The plan crystallized over the next few hours. I wouldn't just sell my stocks randomly, I'd do it systematically, creating maximum impact while maintaining plausible deniability. And I'd time everything perfectly to coincide with Madison's upcoming tuition payment. See, there was something my parents didn't know about Madison's financial situation. While they thought she was finally getting her life together by enrolling in a private college program, I knew the truth. Madison had confided in me months earlier that she was only pretending to attend classes while actually using the tuition money to fund her lifestyle. The expensive private school charged $12,000 per semester, and my parents had been writing those checks religiously, believing their precious daughter was working toward a degree in marketing. The irony was delicious. They'd stolen my college fund to save Madison from her mistakes, while simultaneously funding her fictional education. But I was about to turn their deception against them in the most spectacular way possible. Over the next 3 weeks, I began liquidating my portfolio with surgical precision. I sold my Apple shares on a particularly strong day, netting nearly $6,000. My Amazon stock went next, followed by my Microsoft position. Each sale was timed to maximize profit while avoiding any suspicious patterns that might trigger attention from my parents. I opened a new bank account at a different institution, one where my father's connections in the local business community wouldn't give him access to my financial information. The money from each stock sale flowed into this secret account, building a war chest that would fund my revenge. Meanwhile, I played the role of the defeated daughter perfectly. I moped around the house, complained about my limited options, and even applied for some predatory student loans just to maintain the illusion. My parents seemed relieved that I'd accepted my fate so easily. Dad even patted me on the shoulder one evening and said he was proud of how mature I was being about the situation. During this time, I also began documenting everything. I screenshotted text messages between Madison and Derek discussing their drug purchases. I saved receipts I found in Madison's room showing purchases at expensive boutiques and restaurants. I even managed to photograph some of Derek's betting slips, which he'd carelessly left in his car when he visited our house. The evidence painted a clear picture of where my trust fund money was really going. While my parents believed they were saving Madison from dangerous creditors, the reality was that she and Derek were using the money to fuel their destructive lifestyle. The gambling debts were real, but they were being replenished as fast as they were paid off. 3 weeks after Patterson's revelation, I received the acceptance email I'd been waiting for. Berkeley had approved my application for their doctoral program in clinical psychology, complete with a research assistantship that would cover most of my tuition costs. The program was exactly what I'd dreamed of, working with renowned faculty on groundbreaking research in addiction psychology. The irony wasn't lost on me. While my parents enabled Madison's addiction by throwing money at her problems, I was preparing to dedicate my career to actually solving them. I filled out the acceptance paperwork immediately, using funds from my secret account to pay the enrollment deposit. Madison's next tuition payment was due on the 15th of the month. I'd been tracking the dates carefully, having helped my parents navigate the payment system in previous semesters. The college had strict policies about late payments, imposing substantial fees and potentially dropping students who fell behind. On the 10th of the month, I made my move. I liquidated the remainder of my portfolio in a series of carefully timed transactions, converting everything to cash. The total came to just over $31,000, enough to fund a significant portion of my graduate education and provide a comfortable safety net. But the real masterstroke came from information I'd gathered during my weeks of careful observation. Derek had been bragging to Madison about a sure-thing bet on an upcoming boxing match. The fight was scheduled for the 13th, just 2 days before Madison's tuition was due. Derek was planning to bet big, using money he believed was safely earmarked for Madison's education. I didn't have to sabotage anything or interfere with their plans. I just had to wait and let their own poor decisions do the work for me. The night of the boxing match, I sat in my room with my laptop open, following the results online. Derek had bet heavily on the underdog, convinced that the fight was fixed in his favor. His confidence had infected Madison, who'd apparently contributed her own contribution to the wager, believing they'd double their money in time for her tuition payment. The favorite won by unanimous decision after 12 rounds. My phone buzzed with a text from Madison. "OMG Emma, Derek's bet didn't go well. Can you believe the luck? We might need to ask Dad for more money for my tuition." I replied with practiced innocence, "Oh no. That sucks. I'm sure Dad will understand." But I knew better. I'd been present for enough of my father's lectures about financial responsibility to understand his breaking point. He'd already stretched the family finances to accommodate Madison's crisis and her educational expenses. Another emergency request would push him over the edge, especially when he discovered how the money had really been spent. The 15th arrived with the predictability of sunrise. My phone remained silent until late afternoon, when it finally buzzed with a text from Dad. "The tuition money is gone." His message was followed immediately by another. "Madison says Derek lost everything on some boxing match. I can't believe this is happening again." I stared at the screen for a long moment, crafting my response with the care of a poet writing their masterpiece. Finally, I typed, "Oh really? Chill, not mine." The silence that followed was deafening. I could practically hear the gears turning in my father's mind as he processed my words. For the first time, he was confronting the reality that I was no longer his responsibility, no longer willing to absorb the consequences of his favoritism toward Madison. 20 minutes later, my bedroom door burst open without warning. Dad stood in the doorway, his face flushed with anger, then something that looked almost like panic. Behind him, Mom hovered nervously, wringing her hands. "What did you mean by that text?" he demanded. I looked up from my laptop, where I'd been reviewing course materials for my upcoming graduate program. I meant exactly what I said. Madison's tuition problems aren't my concern. She's your sister. She's also the person who stole my inheritance money to fund her boyfriend's gambling addiction. Mom stepped forward, her voice pleading. "Emma, we're family. We help each other during difficult times." Funny, I don't remember getting that kind of help when I was working 2 jobs to pay for community college. But maybe my memory is faulty. Dad's expression shifted from anger to something approaching desperation. "Look, I know you're upset about the trust fund situation, but we can work something out. Maybe you could take out a student loan to help cover Madison's tuition, just temporarily until we sort out this mess with Derek." The audacity took my breath away. Even now, faced with the consequences of their choices, they wanted me to sacrifice more for Madison's benefit. I closed my laptop and stood up, meeting my father's gaze directly. Dad, I'm going to explain something to you very clearly, so there's no confusion. I am not responsible for Madison's financial problems. I am not responsible for Derek's gambling debts. I am not responsible for fixing the mess you created when you decided to enable their destructive behavior instead of addressing it. But she could get kicked out of school. I pulled out my phone and showed them screenshots of Madison's text messages, the ones where she discussed using tuition money for shopping sprees and drug purchases. Mom gasped when she saw the evidence of her daughter's deception. She's not actually attending classes, Mom. She's been lying to you about school while spending your money on cocaine and designer bags. Check her transcripts if you don't believe me. The color drained from Dad's face as the implications sank in. All those tuition payments, all those proud conversations about Madison's academic progress, all of it had been an elaborate fiction designed to extract money from their already strained finances. How long have you known? Mom whispered. Months. I tried to tell you subtly, but you didn't want to hear it. You prefer the comfortable lie to the difficult truth. Dad sank into my desk chair, suddenly looking every one of his 58 years. What are we going to do? We aren't going to do anything. You're going to figure out how to handle the consequences of your choices. I'm going to move forward with my life. I pulled out my acceptance letter from Berkeley and placed it on the desk where they could both see it. I got into graduate school. I'm starting a doctoral program in clinical psychology this fall, with a research assistantship that covers my tuition and provides a living stipend. Mom picked up the letter, scanning it with growing amazement. Emma, this is incredible. Berkeley is one of the best programs in the country. How did you manage to afford this without the trust fund? I've been investing my earnings from work for years. While Madison was partying, I was learning about financial markets and building a portfolio. I liquidated everything and used the proceeds to fund my education. Dad looked up at me with something approaching respect. You planned this. I planned to take care of myself, yes. Because I learned a long time ago that no one else was going to prioritize my future. Over the following days, the full scope of Madison's deception unraveled like a cheap sweater. The private college confirmed that she'd never actually attended classes, despite being enrolled for 3 semesters. Derek's gambling debts were indeed substantial, but they'd been accumulating faster than my parents could pay them off. Most damaging of all, Madison had been using her access to the trust fund to support not just her own addiction, but Derek's as well. The revelation hit our family like a Category 5 hurricane, destroying everything in its path. Dad locked himself in his home office for hours, poring over bank statements and financial records, trying to calculate exactly how much money had disappeared down the rabbit hole of Madison's lies. The numbers were staggering. Between the trust fund, the fake tuition payments, and various emergency loans over the past 2 years, nearly $300,000 had vanished into Madison and Derek's lifestyle. Mom oscillated between fury and heartbreak, clutching old photos of Madison from high school when she'd been homecoming queen and honor roll student. Where did we go wrong? She kept asking, as if repeating the question might somehow produce an answer that would make sense of the wreckage surrounding us. The house became a battlefield of accusations and recriminations. Madison blamed Derek for corrupting her, claiming he'd introduced her to drugs and convinced her that gambling was a quick path to financial independence. Derek, in turn, blamed Madison for enabling his gambling, insisting that her easy access to family money had made it impossible for him to recognize the severity of his problem. Both of them blamed my parents for not providing unlimited financial support, as if being cut off from their money pipeline was somehow a form of abuse. Derek's presence in our house became increasingly volatile as his desperation mounted. Without Madison's steady stream of cash, his creditors were closing in, making increasingly aggressive demands for payment. I'd overhear hushed phone conversations in the kitchen, Derek's voice tense as he negotiated payment plans with people who clearly weren't known for their patience or mercy. One evening, I came home from my evening shift at the coffee shop to find Derek rummaging through Dad's desk drawer in the living room. His movements were frantic, sweaty, and when he noticed me watching, his eyes held the wild look of a cornered animal. "Where does your dad keep his checkbook?" he demanded, not even bothering with pleasantries. "Not happening, Derek." I kept my voice steady, but my hand moved instinctively toward my phone. "You don't understand, Emma. These people don't mess around. If I don't come up with $5,000 by tomorrow night, they're going to break my legs." The desperation in his voice was genuine, but so was my resolve. "Then maybe you should have thought about that before betting money that didn't belong to you." His face twisted with rage and desperation. "Your family has money. Your dad drives a BMW, your mom shops at Nordstrom, you live in this huge house. $5,000 is nothing to people like you. People like us worked for what we have. We didn't steal it from gambling addicts' trust funds. Derek stepped closer, and for a moment, I wondered if he might actually try to physically intimidate me. But something in my expression must have warned him off, because he backed down, running his hands through his greasy hair. Madison said you were always the cold one, he muttered. Said you never cared about family? Madison says a lot of things. Most of them are lies designed to get what she wants. The next morning, Derek was gone. He'd taken Madison's Mercedes, along with whatever cash and jewelry he could grab from her room. Madison discovered the theft when she woke up around noon, her screams of outrage echoing through the house as she inventoried everything he'd stolen. He took my grandmother's ring, she sobbed to Mom, referring to a piece of jewelry that had actually belonged to our other grandmother, Dad's mother, and had been passed down specifically to Madison despite my closer relationship with Grandma Elena. At least he didn't take more, Mom said wearily. He could have cleaned out our bank accounts if he'd really wanted to. Madison's fury at Derek's betrayal was spectacular to witness. She called him every name in the book, threatened to have him arrested, and even contacted some of his gambling associates to see if they knew where he'd gone. But beneath the anger, I could see something else, genuine fear about facing the consequences of her actions without him as a buffer. With Derek gone, Madison's drug use spiraled completely out of control. She'd disappear for days at a time, returning home in increasingly worse condition. Her appearance deteriorated rapidly, her blonde hair became stringy and unwashed, her skin broke out in angry red patches, and she lost so much weight that her clothes hung off her like fabric draped over a scarecrow. Dad tried implementing various ultimatums. She could live at home only if she agreed to drug testing, only if she got a job, only if she entered rehabilitation. Madison would agree to each condition long enough to secure temporary housing and food, then disappear again as soon as the immediate crisis passed. The stress was destroying my parents' marriage. I'd hear them arguing late into the night, their voices carrying through the walls despite their attempts to keep their fights private. Dad wanted to implement tough love, to cut Madison off completely until she agreed to get clean. Mom couldn't bear the thought of her daughter living on the streets, potentially dying from an overdose while they had the resources to help. She's manipulating you, Dad would say, his voice hoarse from hours of circular arguments. She's our daughter, Mom would reply, as if that simple fact trumped all other considerations. Their financial situation deteriorated alongside their relationship. Dad had taken out a second mortgage on the house to cover Madison's various crises, and their credit cards were maxed out from the constant stream of emergencies that required immediate cash infusions. Mom had to sell her Lexus and buy a used Toyota, a humiliation that she tried to hide from her social circle but that everyone in our affluent neighborhood noticed. Meanwhile, I was navigating the complex emotions of watching my family implode while simultaneously preparing for my own future. Part of me felt guilty for the satisfaction I derived from seeing the consequences of their favoritism play out so dramatically. Another part of me grieved for the family relationships that were being destroyed by addiction and enabling behavior. My acceptance to Berkeley felt like a life preserver in a stormy sea, but it also highlighted the stark contrast between my trajectory and Madison's. While I was researching graduate school housing and academic programs, she was pawning jewelry to buy drugs. While I was building a future, she was systematically destroying hers. The complexity of my emotions surprised me. I'd expected to feel pure vindication as my parents finally confronted the reality of Madison's problems. Instead, I found myself grieving the loss of the sister I'd once loved, the girl who taught me to braid my hair and had defended me from neighborhood bullies when we were children. There were moments, usually late at night when Madison would come home in particularly bad condition, when I'd consider offering help. But then I'd remember Patterson's office, the casual way she dismissed my devastation about the trust fund, and her complete lack of remorse for the impact her choices had on everyone around her. Compassion had to be balanced with self-preservation. 3 weeks after Derek's disappearance, Madison had what Mom euphemistically called a medical emergency. I was working at the campus bookstore when Dad called, his voice shaking with barely controlled panic. "Madison's in the hospital," he said without preamble. "She had a severe reaction to something she took. They're running tests now." The drive to Scottsdale Healthcare passed in a blur of desert landscape and racing thoughts. Despite everything that had happened, Madison was still my sister, and the possibility of losing her permanently created a hollow ache in my chest that I hadn't expected. The emergency room was a study in subdued chaos. Medical staff moved efficiently between patient rooms while families waited in uncomfortable chairs, speaking in hushed tones. Mom sat clutching Dad's hand, her eyes red and swollen from crying, while Dad stared at the floor with the hollow expression of someone whose worst fears had finally materialized. "How bad is it?" I asked, taking the seat next to Mom. "They had to give her medication to counteract whatever she took," Dad explained. "Her heart rate was dangerously high when the paramedics found her. The doctors say she's stable now, but they want to keep her for observation." We sat in that waiting room for 12 hours, existing on vending machine coffee and the kind of anxious energy that comes from confronting mortality unexpectedly. Doctors provided periodic updates that were cautiously optimistic but refused to make any definitive predictions about Madison's recovery. During those long hours, we had the most honest conversations our family had experienced in years. Dad admitted that his favoritism toward Madison had been partly driven by guilt over his own workaholic tendencies when we were younger. He'd missed so many of her school events and milestones that he'd try to compensate by giving her whatever she wanted, whenever she wanted it. Mom confessed that she'd enabled Madison's behavior because she blamed herself for not recognizing the signs of drug use earlier. Each time Madison had gotten into trouble, Mom had convinced herself that this would be the last time, that one more rescue would finally motivate her daughter to change. "We failed her," Mom said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We thought we were helping, but we were actually making everything worse." "You failed me too," I said quietly. "Maybe not in the same way, but you did." Dad looked up from the floor for the first time in hours. "What do you mean?" "I mean I learned not to have problems because I watched how you responded to Madison's crises. Every time she messed up, you threw money and attention at her. When I succeeded, I got a pat on the head and the expectation that I'd continue taking care of myself. I learned that the only way to get your attention was to fail spectacularly, and I refused to fail just to compete with her for your love." The silence that followed was heavy with years of unspoken resentment and misunderstanding. We'd all been playing roles in a dysfunctional family drama, and Madison's overdose had finally forced us to acknowledge the script we'd been following. When Madison finally woke up 18 hours later, her first words were an apology. Not the manipulative, self-serving apology she'd offered countless times before, but something raw and genuine that came from a place of real recognition about how close she'd come to serious harm. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the medical interventions. "I'm so sorry for everything." The road to recovery was long and complicated. Madison spent 1 week in the hospital, followed by a month in a medically supervised detox facility. The physical withdrawal from cocaine and prescription opioids was brutal, but the psychological work of understanding why she turned to drugs was even more challenging. During family therapy sessions at the treatment center, uncomfortable truths emerged about our family dynamics. Madison revealed that she felt pressure to maintain her image as the perfect daughter, even as her life spiraled out of control. The drugs had initially been a way to manage anxiety about living up to expectations, but they'd quickly become an escape from the disappointment of failing to meet those expectations. Dr. Sarah Chen, Madison's therapist, helped our family understand how each person's behavior had contributed to the cycle of addiction and enabling. Dad's workaholic tendencies had created emotional distance that Madison tried to bridge through increasingly dramatic crises. Mom's guilt-driven rescuing had prevented Madison from experiencing the natural consequences of her choices. My hyper-responsible behavior had inadvertently created more pressure on Madison to compete for attention through increasingly destructive means. Addiction thrives in families where emotions aren't expressed directly, Dr. Chen explained during one particularly intense session. When people can't say "I'm scared" or "I feel unloved" or "I need help," they often express those feelings through behaviors that force family members to respond. The insights were painful but necessary. We'd all been communicating through dysfunction rather than addressing our underlying emotional needs directly. Madison's addiction had been her way of saying she felt overwhelmed and unsupported. My parents' enabling had been their way of saying they felt guilty and responsible. My withdrawal and hyperindependence had been my way of saying I felt overlooked and taken for granted. Understanding the patterns didn't magically fix them, but it provided a framework for building healthier relationships. Madison committed to completing a 6-month inpatient treatment program, followed by outpatient therapy and regular drug testing. My parents agreed to attend their own counseling sessions to address the marital problems that had been exacerbated by years of financial stress and disagreement about how to handle Madison's crises. For my part, I agreed to participate in family therapy sessions via video call from Berkeley, working through my own resentment, and learning to express my needs more directly rather than assuming my parents should intuitively understand them. The process was messy, non-linear, and sometimes frustrating. There were setbacks and breakthroughs, moments of genuine connection and periods of renewed tension. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, We began functioning more like a healthy family and less like a crisis management team. Meanwhile, I packed my belongings and prepared for my move to California. My parents' marriage began showing cracks under the strain. Dad had mortgaged their house to fund Madison's various crises, and Mom discovered that their retirement savings had been depleted to cover Derek's debts. The financial pressures were compounded by the emotional devastation of learning that their successful daughter had been lying to them for years. Madison's behavior became increasingly erratic as her drug use escalated and her funding dried up. Without the steady stream of cash from the trust fund, she couldn't maintain her lifestyle or keep Derek's creditors at bay. She bounced between rage and desperation, alternately blaming everyone around her for her problems and begging them to solve those same problems with more money. The final confrontation came 2 weeks before I was scheduled to leave for Berkeley. I was loading boxes into my car when Madison approached me, her appearance disheveled and her eyes red-rimmed from crying or drugs or both. "This is all your fault," she said, her voice shaking with barely controlled fury. "If you hadn't been so selfish about the trust fund, none of this would have happened." I continued loading boxes, refusing to engage with her attempt to rewrite history. "The trust fund was never yours, Madison. Grandma Rose left it for my education, not for Derek's gambling debts. You could have shared it. You could have helped your own family." I straightened up and looked at her directly. "I offered to help you get clean 3 different times. I researched rehab programs, I found support groups, I even offered to go with you to meetings. You chose Derek and drugs instead. That's different." "No, it's not. You had choices, and you made them. Now you get to live with the consequences." She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You're going to regret this. When I get my life together, when I'm successful and happy, I'm never going to forget how you abandoned your own sister when she needed help." I finished loading the last box and closed my trunk. "Madison, I hope you do get your life together. I genuinely hope you find happiness and success. But it won't be because I sacrificed my future to enable your self-destruction." I climbed into my car and started the engine. Through the windshield, I could see Madison standing in the driveway, her figure growing smaller in my rearview mirror as I drove away. 6 months later, I was settled into my graduate program at Berkeley, conducting research on addiction psychology and working with clients in the university's counseling center. My secret account had grown through careful reinvestment, and I'd already been approached by several professors about potential research collaborations. My phone buzzed occasionally with updates from home. Madison had finally entered a rehabilitation program, though whether she'd complete it remained to be seen. Derek had disappeared entirely, presumably to avoid his creditors. My parents were attending couples counseling and trying to rebuild their finances and their marriage. Dad's texts had evolved from anger to something approaching acknowledgement. "Your mother and I realize we made some serious mistakes with Madison, read his latest message. We should have listened to you sooner." I didn't respond immediately. Their recognition of their mistakes was gratifying, but it didn't erase the years of favoritism and neglect I'd experienced. Some wounds heal slowly, and trust, once broken, requires more than words to repair. But I was building something better than revenge. Every day in my graduate program, I was learning more about the psychology of addiction, the dynamics of enabling relationships, and the complex factors that lead families to make destructive choices. My research focused on developing intervention strategies that could help families break cycles of codependency before they reached crisis points. The irony wasn't lost on me that my family's dysfunction had ultimately pointed me toward a career dedicated to preventing similar situations in other families. Madison's addiction and my parents' enabling behavior had provided me with first-hand insight into the patterns I was now studying academically. One evening, as I sat in my small but comfortable apartment near campus, reviewing research papers on family systems theory, I received an unexpected text from Madison. It was the first communication I'd had from her since our confrontation in the driveway. "I'm 90 days clean," the message read. "The rehab counselor says I need to make amends to people I've hurt. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want you to know I'm sorry. You were right about everything." I stared at the message for a long time before responding. "I'm proud of you for getting clean. Recovery is hard work, and 90 days is a real achievement. Keep going." Her response came quickly. "I know I destroyed your trust in our family. I don't expect you to forget what happened, but maybe someday we can have a relationship again." Maybe we could. Recovery was a long process, and Madison had years of work ahead of her to rebuild her life and repair the relationships she'd damaged. But for the first time since discovering the trust fund betrayal, I felt something other than anger when thinking about my sister. My phone buzzed again, This time with a message from Mom. Your father and I would like to visit you in California, if you're open to it. We have some things we'd like to discuss in person. I set down my research papers and looked out my window at the Berkeley campus, illuminated by warm California sunshine. Students walked across the quad, backpacks slung over their shoulders, heading to classes and libraries and laboratories where they were building their futures one day at a time. You can visit, I texted back. But we talk as adults, not as parents trying to fix their child's problems. And we talk honestly, without trying to protect anyone's feelings. Their visit was scheduled for the following month. I wasn't sure what they wanted to discuss, but I suspected it involved some combination of apology, explanation, and possibly a desire to repair our fractured family relationships. I was willing to listen, but on my terms, in my space, as the independent adult I'd fought to become. The girl who'd sat in Patterson's office 9 months earlier, devastated by the discovery of her stolen inheritance, felt like a different person entirely. That girl had been dependent on her family's financial support and approval, vulnerable to their manipulation because she believed she needed them to succeed. The woman I'd become was financially independent, academically accomplished, and emotionally resilient. I'd learned that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is refusing to enable their self-destructive behavior, even when that person is family, even when that refusal causes short-term pain. My trust fund was gone, transferred to someone who'd wasted it on drugs and gambling. But in losing that money, I'd gained something far more valuable, the knowledge that I could build my own future through intelligence, discipline, and hard work. No one could sign that away or steal it from me. As I returned to my research papers, preparing for another day of classes and clinical work, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me here. Madison's betrayal had felt like the end of the world when it happened. Instead, it had been the beginning of a new chapter, one where I wrote my own story rather than playing a supporting role in someone else's drama. The revenge I'd planned had been swift and satisfying, but the life I was building was proving to be far more rewarding than any momentary victory over family dysfunction. Sometimes the best response to betrayal isn't getting even, it's getting better. And I was getting better every single day.